Okay, so live once again, and in this live stream, in this video, I just want to share with you something that I realized recently, which made me quite laugh quite a lot, and I think solves a lot of the strife we are seeing right now between the genders, which is causing so much conflict, so much disconnect, so much divide, especially for modern people using dating apps or social media and these kinds of things, trying to, find love, find romance, find connection. So it's quite simple. I don't know if it's just me or the people that I know and the people that I've spoken to, but when I was a kid, I remember there was the time throughout my childhood where boys and girls were basically separate and more or less at odds with each other. And there was that awkward phase where boys thought girls were gross and girls thought guys were dumb. So we each kind of had our own club and we kept ourselves separate. And really, so much of our identity was about how much better we were than the other side of the coin and how gross they were, how dumb they were. And really, just this immature, childish way of looking at things, which created conflict, which happened to be appropriate for that time of life. I think is actually still going on. And for a lot of people, this is what underlies their difficulty in relating to the other gender, is that they're still stuck in that kind of childish, immature way of looking at things. In that, very much just like they were when they were a little kid, when guys and boys and girls were separate, and everyone thought, guys are girls thought guys were gross, boys thought girls were gross, and we kind of just kept to ourselves and kept separate. And I think unfortunately this is where still a lot of people are still functioning from and are still stuck to it. And I think they're doing it basically those same arguments, the same underlying sentiments through just more complicated, convoluted dynamics and context. But the fact of the matter is they never actually understood the nature of themselves and the nature of the other gender to be able to have understanding, which then understanding then as a basis to actually being able to communicate and relate appropriately. So I think the vast majority of the time, this is really where we're at. Because if you look at what a lot of people put out and what motivates them, it's usually some degree of hurt and disappointment, which hurt and disappointment on one hand is just inherent to life. Most things that we do won't last forever and won't work out. If we're going to try to do anything, we're going to have to deal with failure and rejection. That's just kind of inherent in the fabric of life. With any reward, there's always risk. And with any reward, there should also be some degree of responsibility and accountability. However, the mindset now is to get the reward without the risk, to get the reward without the responsibility and accountability. So that's a fantasy which contradicts the inherent truths of reality. So then that's already going to be a losing situation. You combine that fantasy with poor understanding of yourself and poor understanding of the other gender, you're going to end up in a position of hurt and disappointment, which is if you listen to what underlies, um, on one hand, all the I'm a strong, independent woman, I don't need no man. On then the other extreme is like men being like, oh, I don't, women are trash and women are a distraction and they're all terrible and they're all dumb and I'm just going to do myself and no fap and red pill and live my best life and that'll be thing. But if you listen to what's behind both of them, is usually disappointment, hurt. So where does that disappointment or hurt come from? Usually from romantic fantasies, meaning each of those people were probably had really high hopes and really high expectations, which maybe were not met, or to the unfortunate degree they were completely destroyed. So then they're in this wounded, hurt state. So then the default response is to kind of retreat back to whatever stuff from childhood, which maybe you remember that phase in childhood when boys and girls were basically segregated from each other and boys thought girls were gross and ugh. And then girls thought the guys were dumb and stupid. So we had our own clubs and we kept away from each other. And I think, unfortunately, that's still the predominant attitude and underlying mindset. Because typically, when we encounter difficulty or hurt, we kind of default back to the level or the functioning that was came before. Because usually, I mean, if you just think about your stress response, typically people don't encounter stress and respond in an amazing way unless they've practiced it, which is where martial arts and sports and combat and all these things come into play, is that you actually train your stress response to be a functional, useful thing. But for the vast majority of people, their stress response defaults them to a lower state of functioning. You can see the other examples to it where people having meltdowns and temper tantrums. Same thing in a relationship context. People are stuck in their stress response, so they're going back to a lower state of functioning that's more immature and childish. So then what do we get as a result? All this ridiculous modern feminism and red pill, men going their own way, and all these kinds of things. When in actuality, the solution is to actually behave like adults, meaning take responsibility for yourself, take accountability for yourself, understand your own actions, your own behaviors, your own attitudes, understand the behaviors, attitudes of the other person that you're dealing with, the nature of that person, and understand the nature of the engagement of the relationship that you are participating in, and then be able to navigate that appropriately, which is typically what adults would do when presented with a stressful situation or a problem. However, nowadays it's basically just retreating to some political ideology or some emotional thing that just validates and stimulates our sense of being hurt, our sense of being defensive, which is ultimately what this is coming down to. But my point is, if you really listen, what's behind usually that hurt and that defensiveness and that hostility usually is kind of like a romantic person or an idealist. And I remember, I think it was Mark, or it was some quote I heard like behind every cynic is basically a wounded idealist. And once I heard that, I think that really makes a lot of sense and encapsulates what I'm saying here. So hopefully that makes sense and is useful. I thought it was funny. I think it's pretty accurate. Obviously, it's not the sum total of the situation because there are, of course, many instances in which people are taken advantage of, people are abused, or people are legitimately experiencing wrongdoing, which that's just a human issue. That's just people treating people poorly. That's just people being manipulative or using other people or in generally being a bad person, which is just people being a bad person. And that's not contingent upon anyone's gender or race or ethnicity or cultural background. It's a human trait which transcends culture and history and gender and all things. I think some of the most transcendental human traits are like this. But the problem is when you see the world exclusively through the lens of gender or some political ideology, you conflate these things. You assume these things are the same, when in actuality they're just human issues, not particularly gender based. So, anyways, recapping, I don't know if it was just me or if you remember when you were a little kid and before boys and girls started mixing with each other, there was all the phase where, ew, they're gross, ew, they're so dumb. And then each really had their own club and kept away from each other. And I think really a lot of modern people get into the dating arena and then they experience stress, hurt, confusion, overwhelm, and they retreat back to that immature state. And they really are these little children running around treating other adults like a dog or a dildo or a decoration, some sort of object that's not really based in any degree of a mature adult human understanding. So, anyways, hopefully that makes sense and hopefully it's useful, and we'll talk to you soon.